end of their very long day. I think we can all appreciate that our sense of time has certainly changed a lot over this last year. And so one of my goals for today is, if nothing else, I will hope to avoid by saying good morning, as it is the beginning of our workday here in Los Angeles. But I think I'm really appreciative of this opportunity and this honor. So thank you to your faculty and to your dean and your administration for inviting me. And thanks to each of you for making the time to be engaged in being part of this. I'm excited about a lot of this, including that I understand we might have a few minutes to chat at the end of the remarks. So I look forward to engaging and discussing. I describe with my students in my classes that I come from a very loud Italian family in the East Coast of the United States, where if you weren't talking and weren't talking loudly, someone wondered what was wrong. So I do not ever mind questions or engagement. In fact, in many ways, it's what I'm used to and what I expect. So thank you all, and congratulations again. And I would really be remiss if I didn't begin by offering my most sincere and best regards for your safety, your good health, and that for each of your families, friends, and communities. I'm speaking to you from this morning in Los Angeles, from another community which has suffered greatly during the pandemic. We learned that even though this year has brought pain and suffering to us all, we know that the burden has been heavier on few and really borne a lot of it. And so I know is that we're not going to forget those that we've lost over the last year or those that we leave behind. But we also greet the signs of returning to each other, not just as a return to normal, but instead as a welcome opportunity to reaffirm how much we mean to each other and our importance. And so in that spirit, I sincerely wish for your return and your reconnection to you and yours to be soon, safe, and happy. But this moment also sets a virtual stage for us to recognize and celebrate your achievement. This program, your program, has rightly earned the recognition and notice of communications and public relations professional around the world. As your dean indicated, I've deeply enjoyed our engagement with your faculty, and part of the reconnections that I look forward to in the future are the collaborations between our institutions, which may certainly involve some of you or many of you as alumni and leading professionals. And I think it also reinforces why I want to recognize and deeply respect each of your accomplishments, because understanding the intersection of these moments, the celebration for each of you, but also against the backdrop of such a difficult moment, reminds me of how Aristotle described the importance of ceremonial discourse. And this is where I should probably, in addition to making my apologies from a loud Italian family, my foundation is as a classic scholar in argumentation, rhetoric, and debate. So my thoughts often drift to some of the long-standing human challenges. So when Aristotle was trying to organize the way that we communicate, he recognized that there was moments where we gather to make a decision, such as members of a Congress or a parliament. And there are those moments where we gather to assess facts and determine what had happened, such as in a court of law. But most of our time are not in either of those forms. Most of those times is some version, and today is a special variation, where we gather to recognize a specific moment that's never to be repeated. It's a moment where our presence in our actions reinforce those values. And I think it's something that we probably have all come to think differently about over this past 15 or so months, in the sense that our physical presence, our virtual presence, or our attention may be the same, they may be different. I spent a lot of this fall teaching a large class, one of our largest at USC Annenberg, of about 150 students. And I had students from 12 countries that participating live in the class. And what I came to realize was just the notion of spending that time together, even though many of us weren't even within 1 or 2 time zones from each other, there was something special about it, aside from the learning and the examinations and the academic work. This is what Aristotle helped us to understand, is that our concern in these moments is really the present. And so it's tempting at a moment of commencement or graduation to think to the future and what is ahead, or think to the past and what this last year has been like. But really the value and the power of this moment is taking the moment and recognition of that it is unique. It is not repeatable. the more I've learned about your tradition of having multiple speakers spread out across a few days, I've really become impressed and enamored with and looking for finding ways to adapt it for ourselves. Because what it recognizes is that within each moment, each ceremony, it's unique. Certainly, SCoRe will have other classes graduate, and each of you will have other moments of celebration. But this exact collection of people, moments, and at this unique intersection will never be repeated. So today in this brief session, we gather using this remarkable technology that for many of us might have seemed aspirational just a few months ago. I very much remember 15 months ago being instructed to download Zoom. And even though I spent a lot of time on Google Hangouts, I really wasn't sure what it was, where at this point, I think we've all become pseudo experts in it. And just think about the way in which that we are present together to recognize and acknowledge your achievement. So the highest respect I can offer to you in this moment, your moment, is to share a couple of my experiences and offer a few modest observations to support you on your journeys. And I say that in a very humble way of understanding that I appreciate and recognize how much learning you've done prior to and then over the last year in this program. I also think back on my nearly 20 years as a professor at the University of Southern California. And I know as faculty sometimes that we believe that we have shared with you a very specific insight, and we've helped you learn a specific technique, helped master a new data tool, helped understand and perfect a specific way to perform a task. But ultimately, our most valued form of instruction is helping to reinforce the ways that you'll navigate a future we cannot yet envision. Because I think we come to understand that the true mark of an educated person is not simply knowing the answer to a specific question, but it's the understanding why that question was asked, to understand the meaning of the question, its context, and how it might or might not be asked in the future. Your future is bright, plentiful, and yet to be determined. Our moment today should be a way to celebrate everything you've done so far, share a joyous excitement in the future, and offer those small observations that might help to connect them. Because I suspect that many of you will have, even more than I and my colleagues, a number of different roles throughout our life. I have a colleague who does work in the design and the reinforcement of professional careers. And I'm always astounded when she reviews the annual data on saying the number of careers, let alone the number of jobs that today's graduates will have. And as astounding as that data always is, the part that always gets me in the report is the acknowledgement that many of those careers do not exist. And so in some ways, for us to think about ourselves as educational institutions, our primary effort has to be to train and develop a way of thinking that leads you to be at that moment driving change, understanding change, so that you adapt to it well, which is why you probably can recognize moments of true humility where wonderful faculty like those that you've worked with acknowledge and say, this is the journey that I've been on. These are the points of transformation that I've seen. This is how I navigated it, because your journey and your point of navigations will be unique and will be something that is uniquely powerful for you. So I hope in that these observations, I tried to draw them from challenges or points of tension that I've observed throughout my life and my career. I've tried to avoid discussions of the easy questions or simple challenges because frankly, I know that those are beneath your capabilities and your abilities. There are tensions that we all struggle with. And selfishly, part of what I find the power of sharing these observations with you is because I look forward to the solutions that you generate as leading professionals in public relations, communications, and reputational development. So first, I asked the question of how we come to learn and tell better stories in a big data world. And I realize that our moment in history is often described as different, but it's important that we don't think about that difference in a way that separates ourselves from the past, especially when we begin talking about storytelling. And I would ask this question, begin thinking about within your own families, your own communities. We understand that storytelling for many people around the world and throughout history has been the dominant technology of learning. And I know I can admit I'm just old enough to have been, I think, be reflective of some of my mistakes of youth. And one of them was thinking back and listening to my grandparents tell stories and getting tired about repetition of the same stories, as though we hadn't heard them before, as if we didn't know the characters. But when you begin to have that moment of reflection later in life, and you realize that the technology of learning is not simply to arrive at the conclusion of the story, the notion of the narrative structure of that story by imbuing the characters with traits, with attributes, are powerful learning and memory strategies. So in that way, my snotty adolescent impunity to recognize the importance of their story was actually a sign that that story was working. If I recognized a great grandparent, an aunt, or someone who I never shared a moment on this earth with, but I understood because they were such a powerful example or a character in a story, that learning technology worked. And it worked without a robust streaming device. It worked without a heavy duty notion of audience analytics, but it worked to provide powerful and durational memory. And I think that's something that when we're thinking about today, I raised this question of telling stories in a big data moment. It's because we live in a world of search. We live in a world of where if you were working on a client campaign and suddenly you realize there's a reference that maybe you're not certain if it's the appropriate reference, it's incumbent on you and all of us to pause, to stop, to do that search, to reassess and say, based on the collected available information in human history, in a variety of languages, times, and places, what's the point of knowledge that I can bring to assess that data? And just think about how different that is from any other moment before. Someone sitting in a theater watching a play, someone reading a book, a manuscript, which by itself is a historically finite text of learning. It's a historically fixed product that we come to understand and store information in. So when we think about today, the storytelling that we do, I love to position this notion of we are swimming in data, and we are swimming in a volume of data so complex and rich that the challenge is not merely to make the data available, but it's to make the data visible. And that's why I connect the notion of storytelling to that data. When we redesigned our public relations curriculum over the last 18 months here at USC Annenberg, the single greatest challenge we found was how to continue our expertise in storytelling. We're a school of communication, journalism, and public relations. So storytelling is at the core of what we do, but marry it with the kind of rich data insights that we now know are available and expected. And when you begin thinking about those two challenges, you can understand that this has been our version of that continuous human challenge. So whether it was my grandparents trying to find a way to teach the insolent young kids the lessons and the morals of their family, whether it was a society thousands of years ago that necessarily lacked the technology of permanence, and so utilized whatever the available means were for writing and recording of historical and significant stories, and they found a way to share it. Because when I think about storytelling, I only get worried at times when we lose sight and say, well, everything becomes a story, every example, every reference. And so to me, one of the powerful observations is going back to a core notion of narrative. And I know this is very simple and probably something that's far beneath what you've learned, but to me, it sticks in my head constantly. I reference the notion of narrative as two events that are connected together in a story that are not required to be together. So in some ways, my presence with you today is not required. It is not expected. You have a remarkable institution. You have many remarkable speakers. I am humbled to be asked to speak, but I recognize that you would have had a remarkable program this week, whether without my presence. Our interaction between them, what I share, what you engage, what you take away from, that those moments, that interaction, then the narrative is the relationship of the two. And when you think about a story that really resonates with its readers, whether it's because you've got that really robust audience data indicating they stayed longer, they watched longer, they kept looking for similar content, or whether it's the simple affirmation that you get in someone saying, that poem was beautiful, I enjoyed that story, I'm going to keep that with me. That notion of connectivity that we find within narrative, I would argue, has never been new, but it's been harder than ever before, simply because it's easier and easier to produce stories based on our data-based observations. And I think, like many of us, have watched a fair amount of TV and film content through all of the emerging streaming portals over the last year. And I think one of the things that you found is, and I know it's been a real treat, especially as an American consumer that tends to get a disproportionate amount of American-only television production, to see storytelling from around the world in this last year. It gives you notions that many of the traditional archetypes are not new. There are romantic comedies, there are dramas, there are procedurals about public institutions, there are fictional Historia timepieces. But the essence of the storytelling that we're looking at is in some ways connecting that essential challenge of, how do I resonate with a reader, with a consumer? Whenever anyone is trying to tell a historical story, it could be that history professor in a classroom, it could be that grandparent talking to a grandchild, or it could be the executive of one of the world's largest studios who's trying to figure out how a period piece set hundreds of years ago in an unfamiliar community will resonate with its viewers. The challenge is the same. The medium, the mode is different, but the notion of what's the story, how are you connecting it, and do you actually build powerful narratives that connect, that resonate with the reader, with the viewer, with the consumer, with the listener? And so those are our challenges, and they're not easy challenges. They're challenges that are both made simple and harder at the same time by this global integration. I joke all the time that I've taught big lecture classes for many of my 20 years. So I've come to learn that the ability to turn your camera off was not the first moment where students could learn to not be present in a classroom. There were, even back in the low-tech old days, and I won't implicate any of your faculty, but I know even as a university student, I remember myself bringing other materials into a classroom and putting it underneath the textbook if I was potentially more interested in something else. So the idea of having Netflix on a second screen is just the new variation of the old version of captivating attention. But now think about that connection today when we're talking about audience insights, when we're talking about how to garner someone's attention. There have always been imperfect tools. I imagine you may at some point have studied, the United States used to use a television audience metric service called Nielsen ratings. And I will be honest with you, yes, there's a couple shaking heads, the more I describe it and the further we get away, the less possible it even sounds that this was the cornerstone foundational economic principle for advertising rates for American broadcast television for much of the 20th century. To avoid belaboring the point, this very quick summary is boxes, physical boxes, were attached to television sets within families' homes. And that became the unit of tracking long before we could do any of the devices or the systems we do now. And I share that with my students today only to acknowledge that as recently as 10 or 15 years ago, even that notion, which we can correctly criticize all of the technological shortcomings and the limitations of how long did you watch it and not having the Netflix ability to say, did you like that? Here's the algorithmic answer for what comes next. But at its most basic level, that box still organized the home, the family, the collective television as the unit of analysis. We're so far down the road of the other side of that conversation. Think about the next time that you customize your individual profile within a streaming service. Again, something that not that long ago we would fight and say, well, which VPN best lets us configure to mask multiple countries using the same streaming account password? Where the decision, and this is fundamentally about storytelling in a big data moment, you're seeing so many streaming platforms move to acknowledging multiple user experience in exchange for your unique data and profile. The ability to understand what story resonates with the teenage child, with the mother, with the father, with the grandmother who might be at home, things that the Nielsen system could not do because it used the home as the unit, is a way that speaks to, we have so much more data, we have so many more profiles, but the storytelling challenge therefore has never been harder, it has never been more difficult, but at the same time, there's a real remarkable opportunity to make this work. And one last example that I can give about the way in which this is useful and significant for all of us is that seeing today the way in which that stories that have existed for years are retold and re-engaged speaks to the powerful notion that that story might have been overlooked. You probably have seen or engaged, and I know it's a big day. It seems like it's always a big day in the Marvel streaming universe on the Disney Plus platform, where the Loki show was available today, at least here. I'm not sure if it's there today, but yeah, it's available for the third of the series. Well, the reason I reference this is that it's become very intuitive and easy to accept, well, that's big Hollywood storytelling studio style. They have a tremendous trove of intellectual property, these thousands of comic book series dedicated over 50 years. But the point I want to make for you all is the point of connection. The story about and the success of the Black Panther film franchise was not predetermined. It was not inevitable. At that point, and the leaked emails from the Sony studio leak, which if you ever studied, are a really interesting treasure trove of looking at even entertainment decision makers with all of the best audience metrics at their disposal, were skeptical about launching large-scale superhero films unless the character type was very narrow. So the decision for Black Panther was not something that was predetermined. And in fact, in the history of the comic books, it's not one of the best sellers. It was never a lead character. It never led in toy sales. All of the audience metrics that we think, readership, duration, sales, engagement, not that significantly. Today, it's the intersection of that moment. And even the idea for the filmmakers to acknowledge that the passing of the lead actor, Chadwick Boseman, makes it culturally difficult to recast that character, because even though he only played that character for a short window of time, his cultural resonance is so strong. And if you've got any friends, I have a colleague whose young son has only been Black Panther for Halloween in the United States since the first film came out. And so you can imagine for that child, the death of the actor was a significant moment in his life, because he'd only envisioned that actor in that role and he couldn't really think beyond it. This is a notion to say that if that at Marvel and at Disney, the extent of the large studio budget, can be struggling and working with this challenge to say, what's the right story in the right moment? What's the right narrative arc? What's the way to engage that audience? It is a challenge every bit as complex as my grandmother found years ago, and every challenge is something you'll see. So I encourage you to look to continue to find ways to marry the best of that storytelling in this world of big data that we live in. And so a second and somewhat related but a little different effort is to encourage you to think about building truly deliberative cultures within your workforces, within your communities, and within your teams. And there's lots of ways to think about the challenges of leadership. And I know maybe I'm being a little presumptuous in saying as part of your graduation ceremonies, but I know enough about SCoRe and the process of selection that each of you involved and succeeded in to be in this institution. You were identified not just because you're capable, but because your faculty and administration saw real promise in you. And that identification of promise often tends itself to find its way into leadership roles. And again, maybe this is something where I'm being a little presumptuous and pushing ahead, but I think not. And I think it's something that leadership is found, as you all probably know, both in formal roles when you have a title, but also informal roles where you're part of building the culture of a community, of a workforce or a team. So I feel pretty comfortable in saying to this amazing group of graduates that you will very soon, if not already, find yourself in spaces where you're being asked to develop, change, and evolve the organizational culture of your teams. And for me, one of the most significant principles is focusing on a culture of deliberation. And it's oftentimes when I say that, people confuse it with one of my past roles. I was a debate coach. I taught college students how to do argumentation and debate. It's what brought me to USC almost 20 years ago. I love it. It's a fantastic and a remarkable experience, but I think about debate, the notion of argumentation, the notion of disagreement, as one tool in the broader set of available resources that is deliberation. And deliberation at its core, and I can recommend reading the professor of the University of Pennsylvania, Amy Gutman, is a remarkable scholar. Her work really guides me on this. But the core principle that Professor Gutman describes is reason-based decision-making. And reason-based decision-making seems intuitive. Every time we make a decision, in theory, there is a rationale behind it. But my guess is that you, like me and like your faculty, are constantly inundated with details, with data. I spent a few minutes this morning trying to make sure I had turned off all of the wave of messaging devices so that no one could Teams me, no one could email me, no one could text me, no one could go through all the other platforms. It's a small acknowledgement, but it recognizes you will find moments where you're asked to make a decision, and there may not be time for a reason. And maybe there's time for a reason to be offered in your mind, but there's not time for the articulation and the expression of a reason. Okay. But think about the way in which in an institutional culture, as it builds over time, there's a notion about winning and losing. There's a notion about understanding the decision-making process that happens. Part of the value of deliberation is that it acknowledges that as institutions and as organizations, it's important that we don't treat decision-making as fixed and finite. One of the most humbling things as a manager, and I imagine your administration can empathize and agree with me today on this one, is that knowing that many of the decisions you'll have to make as a manager are decisions you're going to have to revisit in the future. And it could be something like admissions where, well, that's good and healthy. The goal of a repetitive process is to admit a cohort of amazing students like yourself, and then to revisit and return to that discussion a year from now. Okay, that seems like a process where you absolutely want to repeat it. But think about the notion of saying, what were the decision-making criteria and reasons behind it? And not solely for an external requirement, say perhaps if there's a reporting system, but for the community and the value. And part of this understanding I described is that if you focus purely on again, my own background, a debate rationale, where you have an argument or a disagreement and the community engages and you say there's a winner and a loser. Well, there's a rationale if you're engaged in a game or a game show or a competition to pick a winner. Sporting events would be very unsatisfying if there were no winners or no scores. That would defeat in some ways the purpose of the gamesmanship. But in an organizational culture, the notion of the decision that's made today not being something that couldn't be revisited if the rationale, if the reasons change. It's an important way to empower and engage your entire community, your entire workforce. In a far more basic, and forgive me for being a little bit more straightforward about it, if you find yourself in an organizational culture where your decisions are not validated and supported, is it because you're not validated and supported, or simply because there's a better reason, a better rationale, a better decision-making perspective today? That subtlety means that in some cases, building a culture where you ask someone and say, I recognize that you disagreed with me on this, and I recognize that we went in a different direction. Can we talk about how we might pursue that differently in the future? Or, as a common practice that I found, and I manage a cohort of 50 full-time and 100 part-time faculty, I often intentionally validate dissenting opinions. Not necessarily because I'm going to change my opinion, although I have, not necessarily something because I agree, and this becomes one of those other notions of building a deliberative culture. If everything we talked about in storytelling is true, we know that who we are, how we talk about ourselves is going to continue to evolve. It means that if I'm creating a monoculture of which only the ideas that are validated today are comfortable to speak tomorrow, I've done my institution a disservice by shutting down potential new sources. So as an organizational practice, and this is as small and technical as advice that I can offer, make sure people who don't agree with you feel comfortable to disagree with you. And suddenly now we're talking about the richness of why reason giving is such an important part of deliberation. We see a lot, especially in social media regulation discussions. And I know that across India and the United States both, there are robust conversations happening about the boundaries between what are appropriate, productive, ethical norms of communicative platforms. One of the implicit questions is, well, what's the notion of community that is trying to be served by a particular platform? And this is a public relations reputation comms experience. We can talk about that in a commercial sense. The reputation, the relationship may be based on consumers and the producers engaging in an understanding of why they use a good or service. It can be a geographic community. It can be an academic community. But the notion to be gained is to say, we will not always agree, but can we differentiate the decision-making result from the way in which that we create a community? So I'm fond of saying, I'm not just a debate professional anymore. My interest is to say, I want to be a community that is strong enough to debate, to argue, to disagree, but also strong enough to validate and support each other. And so the one phrase that I hear that really rankles me and that I struggle to work out of our organizational culture is, well, we just agree to disagree. If that next sentence contains the act of disagreement, that organization has done its job, because it's fostering the reason-based engagement of, here's our decision, here's the rationale for another path. If it's used as the excuse to diffuse engagement, and oftentimes when you hear that phrase, it's people shutting down and saying that I recognize we have a difference of opinion. Since we're not going to agree, well, then the best course of action is to simply not engage. That organization is failing. It might not fail today. It might not fail in a bottom line or tomorrow, but institutionally, it's limiting the potential of its team. It's limiting the dynamic engagement of all of its participants. And ultimately, if you build a culture that way, that it lets it be dynamic for all. And I think that's one of the last premises that Gutton gets at in thinking about. The reason for reason giving is not simply based in altruism, although altruism would be certainly a good reason. The decision making, and again, use the example of the admissions process. The admissions process is both a process and a product. Each of you are great examples of a successful selection and admissions process, but that process itself has to be constantly reevaluated, revisited. And so you're familiar with the notion of good process and bad product, or good product and bad process. But this notion that takes place in every session, in every meeting, in every email dialogue, where the opportunity to foster differences of perspective, to encourage intellectual creativity, because the alternative, if not, and I can give you a shorthand of when you know that this has happened within a community, that you'll probably run across the idea, or you'll see reference to say that there had been a failure of collective imagination. And it's a phrase that when I teach back in the days where we taught in person and hope to soon again, that moment I would typically pull up on the screen in the room a notion of Google searches related to failure of collective imagination. Virtually any gap in community planning, public policy planning, corporate planning, you'll find that's part of the recrimination and the review process. It was as difficult years ago, and I make this acknowledgement, as I said, growing up in New Jersey, so where the 9/11 in the United States was a day of deep pain and suffering within my family and my community. The United States described the inability to understand that day as a failure of collective imagination, not just pundits and other folks. The official bipartisan government study indicated that was one of the leading causes. I reference this, especially after talking about storytelling, because there is a very cliched American author, Tom Clancy, which my suspicion of you may have an uncle that may have read one of these. These are these very formulaic action movies that I think now Amazon has produced the latest terrible version of. And I actually think now that there's a new iteration coming out. The reason I reference them is that one of these Tom Clancy books, a decade before 9/11, that sold millions of copies, used the exact same plot device of a commercial airliner hijacking being flown into a national building as a storytelling device. Millions sold, multiple efforts to do this. So I use an example which is terrible and dark at that moment to highlight it seems very disconnected for communities to say, well, there was a failure of collective imagination we had never thought about, we had never identified. The challenge of building a deliberative culture is that it's so tempting and easy to look for things that make sense. It's not as though you're going to say, what's the greatest idea we can find in terrible, trashy fiction that maybe someone would read? But it's that notion of the other side. If you're building an organizational culture where you monoculture the sources of inspiration, the sources of information, and the sources of what makes us unique and different, you're really cutting off a lot of what the creativity that can work and be developed in that area. And so that leads me as a natural segue into my third and final big observation that I've learned, which is how do you ensure that within your institution, your organization, and your community, there's greater opportunity for everyone when you recognize that I live and am fortunate enough to live in a way where privilege has intersected virtually every bit of who and what I am. I describe to my students, and I apologize if all these acronyms don't make as much sense in particular context cultures, that as a middle-aged white male cis dude, I am deeply an American on top of that in our conversation today. I'm deeply aware of the notion that my position is one where historical confluence of events have certainly bolstered my efforts. And it's fascinating when I engage in this conversation, and I've told you a little bit about my family to inform this from Italy 2 generations in, and they struggle, and part of this is the reason, as I've done programs around the world, is our notions of race, religion, ethnicity, national origin are constantly evolving in subtle ways that are difficult for us to understand or to reference. My mother, who grew up in a community that was heavily Italian, and then people who were not Italian and ostracized the Italians, has a very different cultural sensibility. If you've ever been asked to watch The Sopranos at some point, you can understand that my parents thought it was a slur because they thought it was an effort to belittle their community. They identify and who I identify in different ways, even though from an outward characteristic, there's not much difference in what you could see. The reason I ask this is because the notion of equity within communities and within organizations is not and cannot be the province of only those who have historically had least opportunity. And in many ways, this relates to everything that I've been just talking about, building better stories, building better deliberative communities. If you consider that within any workforce, within any team, within any effort, you're going to find yourself somewhere along the continuum of trying to figure out the degree to which your representation is relevant to your core organizational principles. And so in my perspective, we use representation as the entry data point. Again, we're going to use some data to reference the broader storytelling. My suspicion is that at some point in the near future, you'll be involved with an organization that will be asked to benchmark its team. And maybe that benchmarking is about national origin. Maybe it's about gender. Maybe it's about notions of race, religion, or class. But one of the things you'll find is that it's disabling and it's also powerfully motivating in terms of what do we want to be? How do we want to develop? And I say this, all of this, knowing that my guess is that each of you could give me a master class on the intersection of the way that those historical forces have already informed the jobs and the careers that you're looking at. So in the United States, and I know this is culturally specific, but I think there are some trends that we can see patterns. Public relations is a relatively recent, distinct industry. And so whether or not people like the Mad Men kind of 1940s, 1950s rise of the advertising agency is the origin story for that or not, again, storytelling, the notion that we tend to describe is there are notions of, in the United States, especially about gender and race and class that inform, well, who became an accountant? Who became an advertising manager? Who was a business person? And we see that today. We go across the University of Southern California. We have 40,000 students across 19 different academic programs, of which Annenberg is just one. We have wild swings in the demographics of our students. Our business school is still 2/3 male students. In a cohort a couple of years ago, they had their first female majority graduate cohort, and it was a moment of tremendous acclaim. At Annenberg, every one of our 11 degree programs is at least 60% female students. And when we think about those patterns and those years, we realize that it's the same complex series of forces that gave rise to, well, who went to university? Who was given the opportunity? How did that develop? If you were having the remarkable opportunity to go to university and complete it, what were the careers available, offered, or even possible for you to explore? All of that I reference is to say that's our foundation. You become part of that institution and that organization. That benchmarking tells you this is where we are. This is the data point of where we are as an institution. But what it can also give you is this broader notion, especially as the world that we look into, it says that we're powerfully aware of history. We're students engaged and motivated, but we're also not limited as to say that our history is the only future. So for instance, and this is one of our challenges unique, and you will have your own versions of this, California is among many places in the United States where we're becoming what we describe as a majority minority community, but more succinctly, it means that Latinx, Latino, Latina students are the majority of our students in our high schools. They're not yet the majority of their students in our communities, and they are absolutely not the majority, let alone represented within our advertising agencies, within our journalism fields, and with our media executives. But that's how I connect these pieces. The benchmarking to say to me, we have a representative obligation to our community. We have aspirational goals, which is that our community, yes, there are powerful reasons why historically did not represent our community in the same way, but this gets to be your future, your opportunity, and your power. And the biggest thing that I can encourage in sharing about this is having that value proposition of that your goals, your efforts are motivated by building a more inclusive, a more engaging, a more representative team or workforce. They're rarely going to come in grand gestures. They're rarely going to come in overnight changes, but it informs small day to day, back to the notion of deliberation. One job search at a time, one promotion at a time, one decision to engage a team member. And I know a lot of that seems intuitive. And in many ways, you probably, like I said, could give me a masterclass of the way that you're seeing this dynamic uniquely play out within your communities. But let me add one additional wrinkle that I think makes this such an important but challenging reference. In some ways, this goal about equity and representation is to say, to turn away from familiarity, to turn away from comfort. It's the reason why that when you're involved in developing a description for a new job candidate or where you're interviewing finalists, you will find yourself, like human beings have done for thousands of years, powerfully tempted to gravitate to someone who you recognize. And I don't mean that because you went to school with them or you played soccer with them. It's that there's something in that, even that notion. And I use that example all the time. If I say baseball versus cricket versus football versus hockey, even just the cultural touch point of what we recognize, what we talk about. It's something that you've seen in classes when you know that faculty can give examples that resonate with you versus examples that you're probably in the chat trying to figure out what does that example mean? I've never read that, I've never seen that, I've never been to that place. That's that notion. The struggle and the challenge looking for equity and looking for broader representation means you may turn away from someone who you can be conversant with in a cultural sense. You may turn away from someone who understands and recognizes with you. I have this way of framing that we think about, I always want to be looking for the best possible team members, the best faculty, the best staff, the best students to work with, not necessarily because I expect we'll be friends. That'd be a wonderful side benefit and a wonderful side area. But ultimately, our responsibility is not to use our institutions to build our personal networks. It's to build that institution to say, with that moment that you're at that nexus of decision making, what have you done to truly find the best candidate, to truly find the most inspiring person? And one of the things I can tell you that we have seen over and over again here in the States is the way in which that career professionals get to the end of their career. And I remember a retirement program not that long ago where this was very clear, where someone said, they realized they had spent a big part of their professional career as a journalist thinking that they were competing against the very best. They worked hard, they were incredibly ambitious, and their accolades were certainly something they were very proud of. But what they came to recognize over time is that that best that they were competing with had a large asterisk attached. That best was already mediated by a series of filters, a series of gateways, and a series of doors that it might have said to other people that would have been remarkable challengers, you're not allowed to compete, you're not allowed to engage. So I say this not because it's easy, and I can guarantee you the corporate and organizational dynamic that you're talking about building and changing will be different. It will be harder. It will be one where you'll be looking and asking and challenging in complex ways. But if you do it, it builds the way in which, and that's why I think it gets back to Aristotle's notion of why we're gathering. You don't live every day of your work with the notion of your last day at work. But if you begin your work about the building the culture of an institution and a team alongside to say, what is the way in which that door has been made available to others, then that's a powerful way. And I use it in shorthand here in the States. I say, once you've got in the door, what are you doing to keep that door open and making sure that door is propped open wider than it was when you got there? And doesn't matter who you are, every one of us can play a role. And if you're not doing that, then that door is probably closing a little bit more and more all the time. So I recognize, and like I said, that these versions are things that are different. And I always make this comment that, I'm, as I joke, all those references before, I'm sure none of these observations is entirely new to you. You've each studied and worked so incredibly hard. You've been exposed to all of these tensions and dynamics. And I would just hope that as these kinds of persistent tensions in organizations are present within your communities, you'll think about and act in ways that offer innovative and ethical solutions, because none of these tensions can be avoided in our future. The world that we live in requires the kinds of compelling stories. I mean, if nothing else, when I thought about this notion, I could have just talked about storytelling today and say, that's the ROI that all of you will find yourself working with. That client will want to know, how do my stories truly resonate with their readers, with their consumers, with their listeners? But if you're thinking about that connection, why they pick your company, why they pick your team, why they're motivated by your leadership, it explains that only really by putting storytelling alongside the reason-giving culture and the equity of the community that they're working with, those three pieces together are longstanding challenges that each of you is going to work with. Each of you is going to find a way to try to create that. And so these challenges, like the future of all of this work, is yours. And today, I will simply close by congratulating each of you and expressing my confidence that the graduates of this impressive institution will be at the front of leading voices in the future. And so I can't wait to see the way that you address these. Thank you. It's been an honor, and congratulations.
Thank you so much, Gordon, for that wonderful speech, as well as all the insights. I'm sure the students have a lot of questions, but allow me to start with one of my own. Just for context, the average age of this group is just under 23 years old. And so therefore they are digital natives. They are some of the most aware youngsters and that I've come across. I'm just curious to know from your experience, what do you find to be the biggest assets that this younger side of Gen Z brings in terms of storytelling, in terms of understanding complex issues, and what do you think they're the best at?
That's a great question, and thank you again. I was trying to figure. It's really perfect in terms of that you're just a little bit older than some of our student cohorts, and it's a great design. I think the two things that I would say is strengths, and the one that I'll be candid and say is a weakness, because I can be honest. It's the value of this moment. I think that the first part of the strength is you accept and embrace the idea of a massive global voice that can also be a very specific targeted local voice. All of us that are older still have, the way I describe, an analog orientation towards communication patterns. And I think part of the way specifically that your generation of the subsection of your demographic works is this notion of, I remember growing up and thinking that it was impossible to communicate with someone halfway around the world that would have been like me, where you all begin at the other premise. If you design the right message with the right platform, it would be logical, if not intuitive, to connect with that user base. And I think that really is an insight that, I have to constantly go back to, because it's no other point in human history has that been available. Whenever my students get down, I always reinforce that you have more communicative power and have more insights about ambitious communication networking approaches than most of the kings, monarchs, and emperors that have ever lived in human history, because they couldn't connect with nearly as many people as you can, and absolutely not nearly as fast. So that's a huge strength, is that you have internalized, because that is your world, that notion of communicating and connecting that. The second strength relates to that last notion, which is that you, while you have an awareness of history, you also have a powerful idea that the structural inequities that have existed don't have a reason to continue in their same form. And they're not the first generation. We had the 1960s in the United States. There have been moments of social change across India. The social change is not new, but I think the depth and the intersectionality of the notion of the way that change is possible is something that this generation has. And those two are connected together. When we teach notions of storytelling about gender norms, I always, and something I've learned from students, I begin with the orienting principle of, well, what is the social value of a notion of gender? We're not talking necessarily a biological interpretation, but we're talking on the other side to say this is in some ways the notion of performing and storytelling about gender is informed by the idea of, well, what makes it significant, what makes it powerful. So those are observations that I really think are significant, helpful. The challenge that I think, and it's the inversion of this, I think that the institutional, the structural part is the area where your generation has been given less visibility into. And so I don't think it's a shortcoming of your generation. In many ways, it's probably a problem our generation has had in teaching your generation, which is, yes, you are right to be impatient. You are right to be louder in voice that's a global voice. But at the end of the day, part of why I talked about deliberations is the bureaucracy of institutions will change, but it doesn't end. And so I think in some ways, building a knowledge that says you build campaigns, especially campaigns for social programs or that are around visibility, they have external metrics about initial visibility, but there's extensive and longstanding research that already undergirds the notions of long-term attitudinal change that transforms into behavioral change is something that is important and powerful. But I know it's hard because in some ways, and this is again the question of voice doesn't extend in that same way. And that is one of those tensions. There are still ways in which, and I think about it, it wasn't that long ago, I believe it was that India was one of the places where the head of state communicated not having a personal email account. And I've used that example, it was a few years ago, to make the point of we begin with the ubiquity of information and access as a founding point. But part of what you recognize is the privacy and the closed nature of networks requires public voice and private and institutional networking. When you marry the two, it's really significant. And that could be true whether you're talking about audience metrics or whether you're talking about social good campaigns. So I hope that helps a little bit in terms of answering your question.
Oh, absolutely. I'm sure it gives some food for thought for our class as well, to whom I would like to hand over now. Any questions from our classroom?
Hi, Gordon. I'm
Hello.
Sanika. So I had this question that first of all, your speech was really thought-provoking. It made me think in like various different directions. So I had this question that we all are product of our histories, of our past, of our sociology, right? Under this pretext, because of our job requirement, we'll be required to create narratives and campaigns that cater to people from different backgrounds and their historical backgrounds and everything. So under this pretext, how do we come up with that? How do we see across our privileges as well as our pasts in order to cater to such a mass audience?
What sounds like a fantastic question. Thank you. And it's I found that I describe myself as a history dork to my friends and faculty all the time. And part of why I think there is your question is so important because history and the contingencies that informed who we are and informed how we are in this place, the way you described, they have to be treated in the same way that we treat any campaigns or any of the narrative or the storytelling works that they do. History is not a closed text. And I think this is one of those areas where, especially as communication professionals, we do our communities and our constituencies a disservice by treating history as a fixed and a finite text. There is certainly truth. I'm the director of a journalism school. I will be the first to say there are facts that can be validated. But the notion of understanding histories is part of what's going to inform to make that possible. And so I think that the example I would give, which is within any story, within a community, there are multiple vantage points. There's multiple ways to engage that discussion. There's multiple ways in which you can provide access points to how that history is told or understood or engaged. And so, I think one that certainly I assume has provoked conversation or discussion is that when you watch this modern, fascinating in its bizarre effort to make the British monarchy a national storytelling trope. I know just from my limited reading of Indian writers that I know it's a complex subject that obviously has to be interrogated in very different ways. But that's the notion to say, well, what are the stories that may have been underutilized and undertold that are every bit as valuable, every bit as authentic, they're less present. And yes, there's going to be controversy. If you've been following the discussion about the tenuring of a professor at the University of Chapel Hill in the United States, who was the lead author of the 1619 Project for the New York Times, it's exactly your question. She did this amazing multimedia project that encouraged Americans to think differently about the origin date we teach ourselves 1776 as the founding of our constitutional convention, but she really raised the question and said, well, but your historians have also said that there's the 1619 date, which is the first time that someone was brought as an enslaved person to North America, part of this effort. And so the story is complicated. They add that layer. It's not uncontroversial, but it is every bit as truthful. And I think that's the piece of, if the storytelling understands and builds in perspectives, it creates points of empathy. And part of the reason I would say in that challenge is that the stories that are not being told in all of The Crown or those other versions about the ways in which that the understanding the other perspectives on what the British call the British Empire is a powerful way to engage that history, because there are those connections. And I think that's that piece. History gives us those connections. It's the challenge of redoing that story away from, in many cases, the traditional first person, the traditional person. And the last piece of this that I can give is, and again, it's by drawing on different references. If you've ever had the chance to read any of Michel Foucault, the French post-structural theorist, one of the interesting observations that Foucault talked about was subjugated knowledges. And the example that sticks to me exactly in this context is most of our history has been taught by the king, the monarch, the emperor, the ruler. And there's a degree to that's factual. But part of what we're also seeing in what we're understanding as our lived histories is, well, what was it like to live in that court and at that time? And that is a vantage point, which if you're trying to say connecting different people, telling different stories, we have the story of the ruler, we understand that story. Do we have the story of the lived peoples? And there may be ways in which we build empathy, we build engagement by those perspectives, and they're there, but they're powerful. And in the last part, you will also then find yourself being involved in catalyzing and revitalizing history. That 1619 project has drawn attention to other resources about how the United States and American society underappreciated or undertold the story of slave people in this country. And so, I think there are similar versions of that, but you're exactly right. It's an ethical orienting principle, regrounding the story from perspectives that are every bit as true, but that give themselves a different texture and a nuance. Does that help?
Surely does. Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, Gordon.
Hello.
Good morning. This is Chiswick over here. And thank you so much for that. That was really enlightening. And I actually have so many questions, but I'm going to stick with one for now. And it's actually to do with a community that I relate to quite a lot, the Asian American community. And I wanted to actually ask, with the rise of COVID-19, as well as the rise of Asian hate, how do you think communication professionals or communication in general has changed surrounding that?
Thank you. Just a great question. And I'm happy to take his other. Also, I'll share my email. So anything I can answer today, I'm happy to engage in the future. I think, and it's a great question because and it relates a little bit to Sanako's question about the surfacing and the visibility of narratives. We've been horrified in the United States by the resurgence of violence against Asian American Pacific Islander peoples. And the only thing that's sadder than the moment is the recognition that it's not actually new. It's a reinstantiation, it's a resurgence of something. But I think it's part of why history becomes so important to ground these stories. The notion of identifying scapegoats within a community in a moment of suffering or unease is not uniquely American, even though Americans have done it a lot. It's not uniquely to this moment, even though we see it a lot around the world. And I think this is where, especially, and I love that we're able to have this discussion. 10 years ago, in a professional setting, I probably would have asked your faculty too, like, is it okay to talk about politics? Is it okay to brand? And it's amazing. We've done this work surveying brands, and our Center for Public Relations does this amazing work on brand assessment. And part of why your question is so important is they say, this is how consumers relate to brands. If a brand is silent on questions of values and ethics, that's less engaging for many consumers. Now, it's exactly to Sanako's point that makes the challenge that much more complex because there's different values than different communities that are looking for different brands. But to your exact question, I think this notion that the United States is now having to finally begin to build a more robust understanding that while the term Asian American is valuable, it itself contains so much that's missing or an attempt to create a polyglot that it loses so much that explains who we are. So for instance, in California, there's a very specific complex history about the way in which that, and as you know, I promise not to get too far into immigration politics, but at least so far to say the United States is a bizarre nation in that immigration is essential and core to who we are, but it's also a very contested notion of what it means. And so for the American West, the settlement of the American West would not have been possible without a large-scale influx of immigration, especially from Asia. And what the difference of that time is to say, but you can also trace the moments to when that was seen as a means to an end, and then it became a way in which it was scapegoating because of opportunity. And I think there's something similar in the year about globalization. The Americans love Walmart. Americans love cheap available goods 24 hours a day. Americans struggle with the idea of Walmart supply chains and the ethics of how that balances. But understanding that complexity requires them to think differently of, oh, well, this was migration from China at the turn of the 19th century. This is the nature of global supply chains in Southeast Asia in the 21st century, and even more to other places. And this is why I love this conversation today, understanding the complexity. Like, you know, we even struggle in the States with the demographic categories of South Asia, which again is a clunky, garbagey term, but it's at least an initial effort to increase complexity behind the idea of folks from large sections of the world. And the reason I reference that is the notion of storytelling. And it's what I do. I used to do a program in London and across Europe and North Africa. And one of the things I would do with students to get them out of a very traditional Eurocentric mindset was, you know, it'd say, okay, what are you looking forward to seeing in different places? And we get to London and they say, well, you know, inevitably some well-meaning, but not super complex student would say, I can't wait to have fish and chips in London. And I put my head down on the desk and just kind of acknowledge it. And I'd say, well, but you're repeating a story that you've heard. It's a very, there's a validity, but it's a very traditional package story. And part of what, and this was very intentional to your point, is I wanted to say, if you experience London through the eyes of the kind of the gift store version of British history, you've missed so much. And so my challenge to you is, if you're here, we'll only be there for a week, can you have at least 3 different variations of distinct versions of Indian cuisine or South Asian cuisine in London? And the answer is yes, because it's like you could easily do 10 or 12 different variations. And the reason I'm highlighting that as the example is to say it's about puncturing large-scale narratives and giving people the tools to begin to engage and say, what is your community? What is the complexity? Don't rely on the notion of Asian American. The community that I live in, the east side of Los Angeles County, we have a large Korean American community. It's very distinct. Their history is distinct, but we have to find ways to develop the texture and the nuance. And whether it's through professional careers, whether it's through storytelling, whether it's through culture. And I know that's why food seems like a glib example, but one of the most powerful cross-cultural historical forces for globalization has been the normalization of different food types. You know, I mean, that's the reference. And even, you know, the whole conversation about who the Italians stole pizza from, and then that became a kind of a unifying presence that you can now eat virtually around the world. But I think that's part of the texture. We need both the big pieces, the big works of historical efforts that understand. We also need to puncture and build in those tactiles day to day. And I think if you do both, it really creates a more ethical premise of where we're looking for. And I think in the same, it gets back to my point on the deliberative culture. We're going to be a weaker institution, let alone a weaker community in a weaker world, if we're not looking for those distinctions. It's a hard one to get up, but I think that's the biggest piece. But you have to do that. But it's also important to also, I think the last thing I'd say is not surrender to the idea that this is unique. American politicians are terrible at saying this form of renewed violence against Asian Americans is new and it's un-American. It's neither. And I think part of the value of rupturing the broad meta narrative is looking us to say, look at the past, not because we're embarrassed, but because we're embarrassed and wanting to be better. So all of that is in that spirit. Does that help a little bit, Jesse?
Definitely. Thank you so much.
Of course.
So, hi, Gordon. I had a question.
Hello.
Hi. So, you talked about a lot about data, right? So something, that comes to my mind is that predictive analytics and, use of predictive analytics in PR. So I just want to hear it from you that, how do you see this use of predictive analytics in PR, and what's the future of it? And what do you think, what kind of resources that an organization require or need to use predictive analytics for, brands and different clients?
That's a great, Bonnie, is that, am I getting it right?
Yeah, one. It's on.
Thank you. It's a great question. And I think it's important too, because, and I try to think about moments that in the future may make you feel a little older because you will have lived through a different period. I think you will tell younger professionals about living in the age of search, and it will make no sense to them. Because to your point, search is not a functional system to do the deliverables that we need. And in many ways, it's an in-between phase of what we're looking for. The rise of predictive analytics is much more powerful than simply updating the way in which of what results we're going to get. To your point, the notion of curation of interest is increasingly, and I think likely to be at the core of a more set of restrictive policies and engagement. So to give you one example, I don't know how familiar you all are with the development that Amazon is starting to roll out this week. I know it's in the United States, I'm not sure differently, but it's about the networking of Amazon devices to create a grid-based network. Is that something that's come up with you all? Seeing different reactions. Well, basically, it's so the whole platform of Amazon home devices, whether it's from the Echo or from other things, one of the challenges, and this gets to your point on, there's both a connectivity question about broadband and access, but it's also to your point about to do predictive analytics in a really robust way, you need a large enough, a robust enough, and a dynamic enough set of data from points in order to make that both in and out effective. So Amazon has indicated that all of their home devices, which natively have the ability to build mesh networking, are going to begin connecting. And the way you started seeing this roll out a little bit was through some popular services saying, well, it's going to be that your neighbor is suddenly going to be able to share their Wi-Fi with you, whether or not they're sharing it, because they're going to be building a data. And it's a little misnomer. This is to your point. It's not about you looking at your neighbor's content. It's about building the back-end data stream to say what's robust enough to make that predictive system meaningful and workable. And I think that's the area that for us, it will continue to grow as long as that technology develops in ways that is not foreclosed by emerging privacy legislation. And I think that's the big concern that we're seeing. I don't know if you all are also having these Facebook advertisements that are running in the midst of some of your other social accounts. Facebook is deeply terrified that they have overshot their estimate on their use of private data. And so I think to your point, what I'm seeing is there's a robust set of data tools that are now being deployed and developing that are starting to give us a way to say, here's an alternative to this. Here's a campaign strategy. Here's a way to develop this. But they're built on some of the premises about the ability to deploy into data. And that's the part that I don't yet know. And hopefully, if nothing else I've shared with you this evening, is that we don't have certainty in. And I think the part that I remain uncertain about is when you're watching countries restrict the use of different platforms, you get to see them in visible ways. So Facebook shutting down our former president, Nigeria kicking their president off of Twitter, Pakistan banning TikTok. Like those are incremental decisions that states are doing based on assumptions. Your question is so important, is that is there going to be a stable set of user data that can be built and can be shared? And I think if there are, then we will see robust analytic strategies develop natively from that, because that's where the AI is trending itself toward. My concern is the fragmentation. And I saw a story today that reminded me of what happened to Snapchat. And it was a way to kind of think about, we presuppose stable sets of data, and assuming that's there, great. But if it's not, I mean, I worry. So I think that's kind of the, admittedly somewhat of a tentative answer, but I'm really a little anxious about whether or not we're going to be able to do it in robust campaigns. If no other reason, and you all could tell me if the politics of this map on, anti-tech sentiments are not uniquely liberal or conservative on the political scale. There are dimensions of both. And I think this is an area where the way that that data works, and especially if you compare this is the last reference, the slow pace of the development of AI strategies across the EU because of their early data strategy, are in many ways my anxiety about if more of the world mimics the EU's privacy policies, you may see that we've got some great technology that just isn't as commercially viable as we would like to be in the short term because of that.
Thank you. That was really helpful.
Thanks. I'm not sure it was, but it's like I said, it's what I'm trying to read to follow along and see where we're going to be, because it's a hard question. And, you know,
Yeah.
I said, this day to day, even seeing the different pipelines. But that's why I gave the Amazon example. I would look for the reaction to it here, because if it works, it's a really powerful strategy instead of focusing on personal mobile devices and on personal, but to use like home networked by the use of the smart home. So we'll see if that might be an end run to what you're describing.
Thank you.
Of course.
And I think I had a question as well. So firstly, apologies if you hear any noise, because I'm pretty sure my neighbors are watching Loki right now. So that would have been an issue. But I have noticed that whenever brands and clients come to us, they ask for futuristic communications and futuristic strategies, but we somewhere forget our cultural roots and forget our historical backgrounds. That is something that happened with Kendall Jenner when she did the tequila ad recently, which has gotten into a lot of mess. So how do we kind of predict that we are going to fall into a crisis situation if we do end up doing something like that? And once we have predicted that, how do we avoid it?
That's a great question. Don't apologize. We said at the beginning of the pandemic, my boss was great about saying there's a series of things we're not apologizing for: noises in your house, kids, pets, family members. You know, it's part of our world. So I think, and you're right, and it's hard, again, by studying history, I always think, and the way in which campaigns develop and work, we do ourselves a disservice to think about crisis communication and crisis management as bad products. We have to focus on them in bad process. And so to your point, I think the core strategy that's involved, which is clients will make decisions that they're going to make. And in some cases, you cannot prevent a client from making a bad decision. But what you can do and have to do is having a core set of values that inform the way the pitches develop. And one of the ones that helps and specifically touches on that appropriation question in ways that might not be workable, we tend to focus on notions of that discussion of narrative that I gave as a useful test, which is, what are the stories that a product, a brand tells about itself? What are the stories that that organization, product, or brand has told? What are the stories that they tend to emphasize? Because there is this almost like mini history of an entity. And I'm not talking about when they were incorporated, when they filed, but it's a cultural history. And part of the effort is to say, and some bits of it will be progressive. They say, so these are your advertising subjects. These are quite literally the models or the actors or the actresses that you've had in the ads. That's one example. But there's the other discussion of the scenes, the settings, the topoi. And one of the ways that you can introduce and raise that is to identify departures from norms and then make sure that there is an agreement of values and ROI, frankly, behind that departure. So if in that case, it's to say, and we see this a lot in the United States, that brands are attempting to engage Latinx audiences in a more robust way. Okay, and I'm not saying that's the exact example, but we've seen a lot of this kind of brand stumble. And part of the notion is to say, well, what is the presumptive understanding of that? Is it simply a very surface level? Well, there's a consumer appropriation, like the answer I give just like about food, or is that really reductive? And I think that's the way that if you give them that baseline, it both gives you more ammunition to suggest and identify other strategies. And again, here's the connection that we see. If you do that representation work, here's your audience, here's your client base, here is the current storytelling structure of what you tend to emphasize. There may already be a gap between who is their intended audience and who they represent. And unless that's intentional, and here's a little bit of the gross part of some of the marketing. We know that aspirational marketing means in some cases you're talking potentially sometimes about clients that are not your clients. But most brands are not like that. And so for most brands, when you're trying to align, I think that's the piece to do it. And then if you do get to this point, and this is the last part of referencing my notion of building more diverse workforce teams, it frankly also reinforces the value of saying, okay, so you're interested in developing a more sophisticated understanding of Latinx audiences. Even that middle-aged white guy, complicate that. So, I think about it as the notion of when you're describing, okay, you're looking for more of a South Indian audience in that. Okay, further complicate that, drill down which province, which community. And I think then suddenly you say, our team, not just where they're from, but what they study and what they understand. And it's something that we see in the United States when you watch American politicians try to communicate and say, well, there's a Latino voter. No, there's not. There's a Cuban American voter that has a very different cultural history than a fourth generation Texas Mexican American family in Texas. That's the version of where I think you provide a real value to your clients, because you help them see the value in the change of what they're trying to tell in their story, but that you empower them with real professionals to say, this is the story that not just is going to be compelling, but again, getting back to the notion of buzz, people will be talking about your campaign even if they're not a client of your product. They'll be talking about your campaign to say, I've never seen that represented in that way. I'm so impressed by the way in which there's that understanding. And that happens a lot. And so that's the, also the way to keep it positive for clients, where you're not constantly just trying to say, well, don't do. They're the client to some degree. They're gonna do what they want to do, but empowering them to say, don't you want to be in a place where you're being validated for your footprint and your reach is telling more impactful stories? It's both better for the bottom line and better for the overall organization.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Hi, Professor. This is Rashmi. Since the heart of the conversation was storytelling, and the concept of storytelling has always been intriguing as a public relational profession for me. I wanted to ask this question that has been bothering me, and I want your point of view on it. If storytelling is a one-way communication road, like we understand that it can be engaging, like how a storytelling concept could be engaging, but if it is a one-way road, and how it is a hindrance in that concept, like today, and especially in today's date, that we realize that audience want to be acknowledged, they want to voice out, and bringing out in that sense, how can we, if it is a hindrance, and if so, and how we can tack it down.
Josh, great question, and thank you. I probably should have talked more about multi-path storytelling earlier. Great, and I think the two things that I can offer to that is, one, stories are only one way if you prevent your reader or your listener or your audience from engaging, and you still can't prevent them. They'll leave bad reviews. They'll downvote it on Rotten Tomato. I mean, that we know denying agency for your audience, your receiver, your consumer base just forces them to come up with other pathways. So I think acknowledging that it's a strategy that has limited efficacy, but more importantly, it is always part of an ongoing series of dialogues. And I think that's why, even back to Sanika's initial question, you've got to be able to engage a client or a brand in the discussion of, there already is a mosaic of stories that exist about a product, a brand. Part of how we're able to use consumer data is to say, in this notion that we just talked about with Push's question, when we already ask, what does a consumer think about a product? It means that we already know that there are stories, there are narrative structures that are already embedded. And you don't always have to be refutational or argumentative to those, but if you're responsive to what an audience expects, then you are already enabling in some ways to say, there's a departure from the norm, and why are we departing? And then within that, you provide different notions of agency for how do they see, how do they experience that, and they come in subtle ways. I mean, I know, now it's really remarkable that I think the lines have blurred so much between the different types of strategies about how to make this work. I mean, think about one of the big areas of growth here is public health campaigns, and the way in which the public relations and communications professionals are being utilized in ways to say the same persuasion goal that we're talking about can be applied to public goods. So you're watching states across the United States innovate with what's the way to get someone who is hesitant about being vaccinated. And the reason I think that's so important to your point is that we've done a lot of one-dimensional storytelling. We've done the, hey, it's a really good idea. Hey, maybe wouldn't you like to see your grandparents? Hey, we've like tried it. But this is this next piece that you're talking about. If your audience is now already in a place where they've shared part of the story as well, they're hesitant. They haven't listened to the first part. You suddenly open the door to a way in which what role do you give them? What role do you allow them to take on? And the more that you're able to build those mutual pathways, that's why you probably have seen these references, and they may seem wild, every bit of where there have been lotteries, where the first $1 million winner in Ohio in the United States won $1 million for getting vaccinated, to the state of Oregon this week announced that they will include, they joked, they said it was free joints for jabs. So they will get marijuana joints as part of handing that people out to do that. And the only reason I reference that is those may seem small, but when you begin thinking about the historical notions of giveaways, about the ways in which the raffles, those were always designed as multi-directional points of engagement with consumers. And they can be ridiculed at times because they may take on a wrong brand association, but they also speak to the idea of, well, what role do we give for folks? And this, the last part that I would just say, all of it is representational politics is also part of two-way storytelling. The notion of finding ways for people to see themselves, hear themselves, and find themselves in stories is a powerful part of this multi-part storytelling. And again, I think about my colleague's son, who will only be Black Panther for Halloween. When you see him and he does the Wakanda, I mean, he's performing part of a film because it gives him the agency to express something that's important to him. And I think that's to your point. The next time you hear a client or someone devising a strategy and they say, well, there's just, it's just this story, and who's going to respond to it and say, so a 50-year-old comic book can be reinvented in such a way to give a little kid pride about what it means to be Black. So I think that, the multiple way storytelling, resistant, and if nothing else works, that's top of the argument. There is never only one way storytelling. It just means you haven't given your audience a way to say what they're going to say someplace else.
This really changed the thought. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Are there any other questions for Professor? Amit, do you have a question?
I have no questions right now. I asked him a dozen plus questions when we met for lunch and coffee in October 2019 on campus at USC, but no.
Well,
it feels like a long time ago. I can't wait, and you're certainly welcome, and all of you are welcome. That it will be very exciting to have folks back and be able to see folks again soon.
We are waiting for the opportunity as well. So any last parting words of wisdom for the class, Professor?
I would just say I'm so impressed, and as you've heard before, that this is a wonderful institution. You've been selected because you show remarkable promise. I'm sure you will find moments where you doubt that promise, because all smart, engaging, capable people at times doubt themselves. But that's why I say the validation of your faculty, the wisdom that they've shared, there's a remarkable amount that you can contribute. And we're just excited to see the ways and the pathways that you develop. So it's been my absolute honor to be here today, this evening, and congratulations to everyone. And I certainly looking forward to seeing your remarkable work ahead.
Thanks for that, Gordon. And thank you so much for joining us. Have a great day, and good night to everybody in India.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.